Smoke moves low across the stones of a city that was never meant to vanish. It slips through broken doorways, coils over courtyards where jars once stood in neat rows, and darkens rooms built for officials, scribes, merchants, and kings. Beyond the ruined gate, the sea is still breathing in the night, calm and indifferent, as if ships have not stopped coming, as if bronze has not become rare, as if letters carried from palace to palace still matter. But inside the city, the old order is breaking. Clay tablets lie hardened by the very fires that destroy the buildings around them. Storage rooms gape open. A palace that once measured grain, labour, wool, oil, weapons, and tribute now measures only silence. This is the doorway into the mystery of 1177 BC, a year that has become a symbol for one of the most unsettling failures in ancient history. It does not mean that every city falls on a single night, or that civilization ends everywhere at once in one dramatic stroke. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate the timing, the causes, and even the meaning of collapse itself. Yet around this period, across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East, something enormous happens. Great powers that had traded, married, threatened, copied, and watched one another for centuries begin to stumble. Some burn, some shrink, some disappear from the written record, some survive, but only by changing into something poorer, harder, and more local. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because the story opening in these ashes is not only about the end of an age, it is about how a world can look permanent until the hidden joints inside it begin to crack. Just before the fall, the Bronze Age world appears almost impossibly connected. Egypt still commands the Nile, its temples bright with painted reliefs, and its scribes confident in a tradition already older than many later empires would ever become. To the north, the Hittite kings ruled from Anatolia, sending letters in diplomatic language and holding together cities, vassals, treaties, and rival princes. Across the Aegean, Mycenaean palaces rise on fortified hills, where administrators write in Linear B and count the goods of a warrior elite. Along the Levantine coast, ports like Ugarit turn the sea into a road, receiving copper from Cyprus, timber, wine, oil, ivory, and news from everywhere worth fearing. This is not a primitive world waiting to become civilized. It is already sophisticated, formal, and deeply aware of itself. Kings call one another brothers when diplomacy requires it. They exchange gifts of gold, lapis, horses, chariots, musicians, brides, and carefully worded complaints. A ruler may write angrily because the gold sent to him is not generous enough, or because a shipment is late. Such details can feel almost familiar, as if the Bronze Age courts are filled with ancient versions of impatient officials and suspicious royal families, but they reveal something larger. This world is not made of isolated kingdoms standing alone in the dark. It is a web, and the web is beautiful. It is also fragile. The late Bronze Age depends on movement. Copper has to travel. Tin has to travel even farther, because without tin, copper does not become true bronze in the quantities needed for weapons, tools, armour, fittings, and prestige objects. Grain moves from fertile zones towards cities and palaces that cannot always feed themselves easily. Timber moves where forests are scarce. Scribes move ideas in clay. Ships stitch together harbours, islands, river mouths, and palace storehouses. The system is powerful precisely because no single place has everything it needs. That is also its weakness. When one route fails, Another may compensate. When many routes fail together, compensation becomes panic. The cities themselves do not always confess this vulnerability. Archaeology often shows their confidence: first thick walls, monumental gates, frescoed rooms, administrative tablets, workshops, storage magazines, and rich burials. But beneath the architecture of authority lies a constant act of balancing. Palaces collect and redistribute. They promise protection, order, wages, food rations, and ritual stability. They turn harvests into records, records into commands, commands into movement, and movement into power. When the palace works, it can appear almost natural. When it fails, the dependence it created becomes painfully visible. The year 1177 BC is often associated with the reign of Rameses III in Egypt, and with Egyptian accounts of dangerous groups arriving by land and sea. Those accounts are dramatic, carved in royal language, and shaped by the need to make the pharaoh look victorious. They speak of foreign lands thrown into turmoil and enemies advancing in force. They have helped create the famous image of the Sea Peoples, a name modern scholars use for several groups whose identities are still debated. Yet even here, at the famous centre of the story, the ground is unstable. Egyptian inscriptions are not neutral reports. They are monuments of power. They preserve fear and propaganda together. That is why the collapse cannot be understood as a simple invasion story. Even though invasion is part of the evidence in some places, cities burn, but not all fires mean the same thing. A destruction layer may point to attack, accident, earthquake, internal unrest, or some combination that no surviving tablet explains. A palace may fall while nearby villages continue. A kingdom may lose its capital but leave descendants in smaller states. A trade network may decline without every community collapsing in the same way. What survives in the record suggests a rolling crisis, uneven and prolonged, spreading through systems already under pressure. The most unsettling possibility is that no single enemy breaks this world. Instead, the world may break because too many shocks arrive close together. Drought places pressure on harvests. Shortage makes governments less able to reward loyalty. Earthquakes damage cities and palaces that are costly to repair. Trade disruption makes bronze harder to produce and prestige harder to maintain. Mercenaries, migrants, raiders, and displaced communities move through regions already anxious. Palace administrations, built for control, struggle with uncertainty. Rulers who once exchanged gifts as equals begin to face emergencies that ceremonies cannot solve. There is a quiet terror in that kind of collapse. It is the terror of messages unanswered, ships delayed, harvests disappointing, borderlands restless, warehouses emptier than expected, and rumours travelling faster than officials can respond. It is the moment when a king realises that the crisis is not local. Somewhere else has already failed. Somewhere else cannot send help. The great international age begins to reveal a darker truth: connection can spread strength. But it can also spread weakness. By the time the fires cool in many ruined places, the Eastern Mediterranean is no longer the same world. The Hittite imperial centre disappears, though Hittite-related cultures survive elsewhere. Mycenaean palace culture in Greece fades, and with it the bureaucratic writing system used to run those palaces. Ugarit is destroyed and never returns as the same power. Egypt survives, but survival costs it dearly. Its reach narrows, its wealth contracts, across regions. Monumental building declines in some places, literacy shrinks in others, and smaller communities adapt in ways that are harder for history to see because they leave fewer grand inscriptions behind. Yet collapse is not extinction. People continue to live, farm, remember, trade, worship, and rebuild. New political worlds begin forming from the wreckage of the old. The end of the Bronze Age is not the end of human resilience. It is the end of a particular arrangement of power, wealth, and dependence. Still, the mystery remains powerful because the collapse feels close to something modern minds recognize: a world of international trade, diplomatic language, specialized economies, elite confidence, military rivalry, and climate stress suddenly discovers that complexity does not guarantee safety. Then, slowly in some places and violently in others, tomorrow stops obeying the old rules. The tablets harden in the fire, preserving the last gestures of administration by accident. What was meant to be temporary becomes archaeological. What was meant to be powerful becomes fragile evidence. And out of those broken rooms, those unanswered letters, and those blackened stones, the question begins its long afterlife. Why did one of the ancient world's most sophisticated civilizations of civilizations collapse? To understand why the fires of 1177 BC matter so much, the world before them has to be seen not as a collection of lonely kingdoms, but as a kind of Bronze Age international system, older than the classical world, older than Rome, older than the empires most people imagine when they hear the word ancient. It stretches across seas, deserts, river valleys, mountain passes, and palace roads, held together by ships, scribes, treaties, marriages, threats, gifts, and above all by the metal that gives the age its name. Bronze is not just a material, it is a technology, a military advantage, a symbol of elite authority, and a quiet reminder that no great king, however mighty his titles, can rule without things that come from somewhere else. Bronze begins with copper, and copper can be found in several regions of the eastern Mediterranean world, especially on Cyprus, whose very name later becomes linked with the metal. But copper alone is not enough for the classic alloy that defines the age. To make good bronze in the quantities demanded by armies, workshops, temples, palaces, and elite households, tin is needed, and tin is far more difficult to secure. Some of it may have come from regions far to the east, from Central Asia or beyond, and some from other distant sources that scholars still debate. The routes are difficult to reconstruct, because the objects survive more easily than the journeys that produced them. Yet the result is clear: a palace that wants bronze weapons, bronze tools, bronze fittings, bronze vessels, and bronze prestige cannot simply look inward. It must participate in a world. This is one of the great hidden truths of the late Bronze Age. Power is local in its monuments, but international in its supply chains. A king may sit in a capital surrounded by walls and guards, but the strength of his court depends on miners, sailors, caravan leaders, shipwrights, translators, scribes, farmers, oxen, donkeys, roads, harbours, safe anchorages, and political relationships that extend far beyond his direct control. The palace may make itself look like the centre of the universe, and in its own inscriptions it often does, but even the proudest ruler is waiting for shipments. He's waiting for copper, tin, grain, horses, wood, luxury goods, and news. That waiting is usually invisible when the system works. It becomes obvious only when the ships stop arriving. In Egypt, the Nile gives a kind of stability that many other kingdoms envy. The river floods, fields are measured, grain is harvested, and scribes turn abundance into administration. Egypt has deserts as defensive walls, temples as ideological engines, and a royal tradition of astonishing durability. But even Egypt is not sealed off. It wants timber from the Levant, silver from abroad, copper and other metals through trade and tribute, and diplomatic recognition from other great kings. Egyptian power reaches into Canaan at times. Garrisons are maintained, local rulers are watched, and the pharaoh presents himself as lord of lands beyond the river valley. But this reach is expensive. It depends not only on soldiers, but on the functioning of a wider zone that can feed, supply, and acknowledge Egyptian authority. North of Egypt, the Hittite Empire rules from Anatolia, a landscape of plateaus, mountains, and contested frontiers. Its capital, Hattusa, stands inland, fortified and monumental, with gates that seem to speak in stone about royal force. The Hittites are not outsiders to civilization, nor are they merely enemies in Egyptian stories. They are one of the great powers of the age, with archives, diplomacy, law, military sophistication, and a political structure that holds together many peoples and territories under imperial pressure. Their world is less naturally unified than the Nile Valley. It requires constant management. Vassals must remain loyal. Rival claimants must be contained. Grain must be secured. Borderlands must be watched. In good times, this produces imperial grandeur. In bad times, every dependency becomes a possible fracture. Across the Aegean, the Mycenaean palaces form a different kind of power. They are not one empire in the same way as Egypt or the Hittite state, but a network of palace centres, Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, Thebes, and others. Their rulers build fortifications so massive that later Greeks imagine only giants could have moved such stones. Their scribes use Linear B, a script that records an early form of Greek, not for poetry or philosophy, but for administration sheep, wool, oil, bronze, chariot parts, personnel, rations, land, and offerings. This is a world of careful counting. The palace sees society through lists. Its power depends on knowing who owes what, who works where, and what is stored in which room. The clay tablets were never meant to last for thousands of years. They were routine records, temporary tools of management. Fire, the destroyer of the palaces, accidentally bakes them into survival. Along the Levantine coast, cities such as Ugarit show the brilliance of the connected world perhaps more clearly than anywhere. Ugarit is not the largest kingdom, but it is positioned like a hand resting on the pulse of the age. Ships arrive from Cyprus and the Aegean. Messages move between kings. Merchants handle goods, languages, and risks. Scribes write in multiple scripts and traditions, including cuneiform, and one of the world's important alphabetic systems emerges in this broader region. A port city like Ugarit lives by openness. It gains wealth from movement. It hears rumours early. It also feels danger early, because a port is never only a gateway for prosperity, it is a gateway for trouble. Cyprus, rich in copper, becomes essential to the bronze economy. Its island position makes it both protected and exposed. It is surrounded by sea routes, pulled into the ambitions of greater powers, and tied to the demand for metal across the region. Canaan sits in a corridor between empires, a zone of cities, local rulers, Egyptian influence, trade, conflict, and cultural mixture. Assyria and Babylon, farther east, are part of the larger diplomatic and political landscape, sometimes rising, sometimes constrained, never irrelevant. No map of this world is simple, because power is layered. There are great kings, lesser kings, vassals, merchants, nomads, mercenaries, local communities, temple institutions, and palace officials, all operating within a system that is both organized and unstable. What makes this world so striking is not only its wealth, but its self-awareness. The great rulers know one another. They send envoys. They complain about etiquette. They arrange royal marriages that are less about romance than about strategy, prestige, and controlled obligation. They exchange gifts that look generous but function as political messages. A shipment of gold, a group of horses, a carved object, a skilled artisan, a princess, a physician, or a statue can all carry meaning. Diplomacy is not soft decoration around power. It is one of the tools by which the system holds itself together. Yet the same diplomacy reveals anxiety. Letters sometimes show rulers worrying about disrespect, delay, loyalty, illness, famine, or insufficient aid. The grand language of brotherhood among kings masks a world in which everyone measures status carefully. To send too little is an insult. To arrive late is suspicious. To fail to answer can be dangerous. This is a world where communication is formal, but fear leaks through the formalities. The evidence remains incomplete, because we see only the documents that survived by chance, in archives that were not destroyed entirely or were destroyed in just the right way. Still, what survives in the record suggests a network dense enough to be impressive and tense enough to be brittle. The everyday result of this connectivity is a world filled with things that have travelled farther than most people ever will. A sword may contain metal from distant sources. A palace storeroom may hold oil in jars influenced by foreign styles. A royal court may display luxury materials from lands known more through trade than direct experience. A scribe may use a diplomatic language learned because kings must speak across borders. A harbour warehouse may contain the fingerprints of sailors, potters, and merchants from many shores. The Bronze Age is not global in the modern sense, but for those living inside its eastern Mediterranean heart, it can feel vast, interconnected, and old. That is why its collapse is so haunting. A simple village can suffer and recover within a local world, but a palace civilization built on bronze, shipping, diplomacy, and redistribution is vulnerable to failures that begin far away. If tin roots falter, weapons and tools become harder to supply. If grain harvests fail in one region, trade and tribute are strained elsewhere. If one kingdom collapses, refugees, raiders, unpaid soldiers, broken treaties, and lost markets can unsettle its neighbours. If ports burn, inland powers feel the heat later in the form of scarcity. No single explanation fully accounts for this, because the system itself is the explanation. The Late Bronze Age is strong because it is connected, and it is endangered for the same reason. Before the collapse becomes visible as ash, it exists as dependence. It exists in the need for bronze, the need for grain, the need for scribes, the need for ships, the need for kings to believe that other kings will keep playing by the old rules. For centuries, the arrangement works well enough to look permanent. Then, somewhere in the machinery of the age, the strain begins to accumulate. The beautiful web tightens. The metal that binds the world together begins to reveal the distances hidden inside it. Inside the palaces of the Late Bronze Age, collapse does not first appear as a burning wall or a broken gate. It appears as a number that no longer balances. It appears as a shipment that should have arrived but has not, a ration list that has to be reduced, a field that yields less grain than expected, a team of workers that cannot be supplied, a military unit that needs bronze fittings when the metal reserves are low. The palace is built to make disorder look manageable. It takes the wide, unpredictable life of a kingdom and turns it into tablets, seals, storerooms, commands, and schedules. It is the mind of the state, or at least it tries to be. But a mind that can count everything can also discover, with terrible clarity, when everything is going wrong. The palace economies of the Eastern Mediterranean are not all identical, but they share a deep assumption. Central authority can gather resources, organize labor, redistribute goods, and maintain the social order through control. At Pylos, at Mycenae, at Hattusa, at Ugarit, at Egyptian administrative centers, power does not simply rest on warriors or royal blood. It rests on storage. It rests on the ability to collect grain, oil, wool, metal, animals, textiles, timber, and finished objects, then send them where the elite system needs them to go. The palace is not only a residence, it is a warehouse, a record office, a ritual stage, a military headquarters, a tax machine, and a symbol that the world has a center. Scribes are the quiet servants of that center. They sit in rooms that may not look dramatic when excavated, but they help hold kingdoms together. Their work can seem dry from a distance: lists of sheep, lists of women and men assigned to tasks, lists of oil jars, lists of wheels, lists of bronze, lists of offerings, lists of land. Yet these lists are not trivial. They are the bloodstream of palace power. A ruler cannot command what his officials cannot locate. A workshop cannot produce if raw materials are not counted. Soldiers cannot be equipped if the stores are unknown. Temples cannot receive offerings if the calendar and the goods are not coordinated. In a world without digital memory, without printed forms, without modern banking, the clay tablet is a tool of astonishing importance. There is something almost intimate about these records, because they preserve not the speeches kings wanted remembered, but the routine machinery that kings took for granted. A tablet from a palace may tell us more about how power actually worked than a victory inscription carved to impress the gods. It may reveal that bronze was being allocated carefully, that chariot parts were monitored, that textile production was organized at scale, or that food rations were distributed to dependent workers. These are not stories in the ordinary sense. They are fragments of administration. Yet when placed beside the ruins, they become a different kind of drama, the drama of a society trying to keep itself ordered through measurement. What survives in the record suggests that palace systems could mobilize enormous resources when conditions were favorable. They could build walls, support artisans, feed attached laborers, sponsor trade, store surplus, and project royal prestige far beyond the immediate household of the king. But their strength came with a hidden bargain. The more a society depends on central redistribution, the more dangerous it becomes if the center falters. If a palace controls access to metal, land rights, food stores, craft production, and military equipment, then the collapse of that palace is not merely a change of government, it is a shock to the entire pattern of life around it. This is why the late Bronze Age palace can be imagined as both impressive and brittle. Its walls are thick, its storerooms deep, its rituals ancient, its scribes precise. Yet it requires obedience from below, reliability from the countryside, safe movement along roads and sea lanes, cooperation from elites, and enough surplus to reward those who serve it. If harvests fail, the palace must still feed dependents. If trade routes falter, the palace must still maintain its prestige. If vassals become restless, the palace must still enforce loyalty. If enemies threaten, the palace must still equip defenders. The institution is designed to concentrate power, but concentration means that stress also concentrates there. A lesser-known but revealing detail is how temporary some of the famous records may have been intended to be. Many clay tablets from the Aegean palaces were not carefully fired for permanent archives. They were administrative notes, meant to be used for a season or a year, then recycled or discarded when no longer needed. They survived because destruction fires baked them hard. In other words, some of the clearest voices from the last days of these systems were preserved by catastrophe. Without the flames that ended the palaces, much of their bureaucratic memory might have dissolved back into mud. The collapse did not only destroy evidence, in a strange accident, it created evidence. That accident shapes how the past is seen. Archaeologists can read the final administrative moments of some places more clearly than the long, ordinary centuries before them. This can make collapse appear sharper than it felt to everyone living through it. For some communities, decline may have been gradual, more shortages, fewer shipments, more insecurity, smaller expectations. For palace officials, though, the crisis could become sudden once the system could no longer hide its imbalance. A machine may make noise for a long time before it breaks, but the break itself can still sound abrupt. The palace also depends on belief. People must believe that the king can protect them, that officials can distribute fairly enough to be tolerated, that the gods are being honoured, that enemies can be managed, that obligations still make sense. This belief is not sentimental. It is practical. A farmer brings produce because the system has force behind it, but also because the system is expected to endure. A craftsman works for palace allocation because the palace controls the materials and rewards. A local ruler obeys an overlord because rebellion seems more dangerous than loyalty. Once crisis weakens that belief, every relationship must be renegotiated, and renegotiation in a hungry, frightened world is rarely peaceful. The palaces are therefore vulnerable not only to attack from outside, but to failure from within. A shortage can become a political crisis. A political crisis can become a military crisis. A military crisis can disrupt agriculture and trade, producing more shortage. No single explanation fully accounts for this, because the pieces feed one another. The same administrative system that allows a palace to respond to trouble may also slow it down, blind it to local realities, or make ordinary people dependent on decisions made far away. When pressure spreads across several regions at once, even competent rulers may find that the old methods are not enough. This does not mean the Bronze Age palaces were foolish. They were intelligent adaptations to their world, and for a long time they worked. Their administrators understood storage, labour, accounting, diplomacy, military preparation, and ritual legitimacy. Their success is precisely what makes their fragility so important. They had solved many problems of complex society, but their solutions created new risks. Specialization made production efficient, but dependent. Long-distance trade made elites wealthy, but exposed. Central authority made large projects possible, but concentrated failure. Writing made control more precise, but precision did not create grain, copper, tin, or rain. As the late Bronze Age approaches its breaking point, the palace world still looks formidable from the outside. The gates stand, the archives function, the kings bear old titles, the rituals continue. Scribes press signs into clay as if the next season will be manageable because the last season was recorded. Yet somewhere beyond the storeroom wall, fields are less certain, roads less safe, ships less reliable, and alliances less comforting. The palace can count the jars, weigh the metal, assign the workers, and seal the doors. What it cannot do is command the wider world to remain stable. That is the hidden fragility at the heart of the Bronze Age mystery. The system does not collapse because it is simple. It collapses because it is complex, successful, and stretched across too many points of failure. The scribes can see parts of the crisis as numbers. The kings can feel it as threat. The people living under palace authority experience it as ration, labour, rumour, fear, and adaptation. And when the first great centres begin to fail, the tablets left behind do not explain everything. They only let us hear, faintly, the sound of an organised world reaching the limits of its own design. At Ugarit, the crisis becomes small enough to hold in the hand, not as a theory, not as a grand map of arrows crossing the sea, but as clay, pressed by a stylus, dried, stored, and then trapped in destruction. The city stands on the coast of northern Syria, near the edge where inland routes meet the Mediterranean, and for generations it has lived as one of the great listening posts of the Bronze Age world. Its kings are not the mightiest rulers of the age, but they sit at a place where messages converge. Egypt matters here, the Hittites matter here, Cyprus matters here, the Aegean matters here, merchants, envoys, sailors, scribes, and officials move through its orbit, and every movement carries more than goods, it carries warning. Ugarit is one of those places where archaeology gives the collapse a voice, though the voice is broken, partial, and surrounded by silence. Its ruins preserve palaces, houses, temples, workshops, archives, and traces of a city that knows how to write in more than one world. Scribes use cuneiform. They record legal agreements, diplomatic messages, economic transactions, myths, rituals, and administrative lists. In this city, writing is not a single narrow tool. It is a whole environment of memory. The famous alphabetic cuneiform of Ugarit, with its signs adapted to a local language, is one of the surprising details that makes the site so important, long before alphabetic writing becomes familiar around the Mediterranean. Ugarit shows a culture experimenting with ways to make language more efficient, portable, and precise. It is not merely a victim waiting for the end. It is a clever, cosmopolitan city at the height of a connected age. That is what makes its final traces so haunting. The city's last documents do not read like people who believe they are living through a minor interruption. They suggest anxiety, urgency, and strained communication. Scholars still debate the exact sequence of events, the precise dates, and the identity of those who destroyed the city. But what survives in the record suggests a world under pressure from multiple directions. Ugarit's king appears caught between obligations to greater powers and the immediate needs of his own defence. Ships and troops are not simply symbols on a map, they are real resources, and when they are away, delayed, or unavailable, a coastal city can become terribly exposed. One of the most famous pieces of evidence associated with Ugarit is the desperate tone of letters sent in a time of danger. The details are debated, and no surviving text gives a complete eyewitness account of the city's final hours. But the impression is unmistakable. Rulers are asking for help, reporting threats, or explaining that forces are absent. The old diplomatic system is still functioning just enough to send messages, but not enough to guarantee rescue. That is a chilling stage of collapse. The language of authority continues. Seals, messengers, titles, and formal appeals still exist. Yet beneath the official forms, the machine is failing. A city like Ugarit depends on the sea, but the sea is never loyal. In times of confidence, it brings copper, timber, wine, oil, textiles, luxury goods, foreign styles, and profit. In times of crisis, it can bring raiders, displaced groups, enemy ships, and news of disasters elsewhere. The same harbour that makes Ugarit wealthy makes it vulnerable. The same openness that allows scribes to know many languages and merchants to know many routes also exposes the city to shocks travelling from far beyond its walls. No single explanation fully accounts for this vulnerability, because a port is always both a shield and a wound. It can call for help, but help must travel. It can store goods, but storage attracts danger. It can read the world, but reading danger does not mean stopping it. The destruction of Ugarit around the end of the Bronze Age appears severe and final. The city is burned and abandoned, and unlike some places that recover in altered form, Ugarit does not return as the same urban power. Its archives, preserved in the ruins, become a kind of accidental memorial. The clay tablets survive because the buildings around them are destroyed. Again, the Bronze Age gives us knowledge through catastrophe. A peaceful archive may be cleaned, reused, dispersed, or lost. A burning city can harden its last records into archaeological testimony. It is a cruel bargain. But much of what is known about these final years comes from exactly that kind of accident. The ruins also remind us how difficult it is to read destruction. A blackened layer can look decisive, but it does not always explain who lit the fire, why the defense failed, whether the attackers came by sea or land, whether internal disorder played a role, or whether the city had already been weakened by shortages. At Ugarit, as across the eastern Mediterranean, the evidence remains incomplete. There are signs of sudden destruction, but sudden destruction can be the last visible moment of a crisis that began years earlier. A city can die in one night after being weakened for a generation. The final flame is not always the first cause. Other places offer similar fragments of alarm. In some late Bronze Age centres, tablets speak of mobilization, watching coastlines, guarding territory, moving goods, or preparing defences. At Pylos in Greece, some of the final administrative records have been interpreted as evidence of concern for coastal security, though scholars still debate exactly what they mean. In the Levant and Anatolia, destruction layers appear at different sites. Not always at the same time and not always with the same pattern. Some cities are burned, some are abandoned, some shrink, some continue under changed conditions. The map of collapse is uneven, and that unevenness is important. It warns against imagining a single wave sweeping cleanly across the world. Still, the fragments begin to rhyme with one another. A message asks for help. A palace counts equipment. A city burns. A trade route falters. A ruler disappears from the record. A script falls out of use. A settlement pattern changes. These are not identical clues, but together they suggest a shared atmosphere of strain. The Late Bronze Age does not leave a complete diary of its death. It leaves scattered last pages, some singed at the edges, some preserved only because the shelves fell in the right direction. Ugarit matters because it makes the collapse feel immediate. The grand powers can seem distant in their royal monuments, but Ugarit's archives bring the crisis down to human-scale officials trying to communicate, leaders trying to respond, scribes still pressing signs into clay while the old world contracts around them. The city's end is not only a local tragedy, it is a demonstration of what happens when a network society loses the reliability of the network. A port that once thrived by receiving the world now receives the world's disorder. And so, among the ruined rooms of Ugarit, the Bronze Age mystery changes shape. It is no longer only a question of why great kingdoms collapsed. It becomes a question of how people inside those kingdoms experienced the first signs of failure. They did not see a neat historical period ending. They saw ships missing, orders changing, messages growing urgent, stores becoming precious, and danger moving closer. They lived inside the uncertainty before later historians gave it a name. The clay remembers only pieces, but those pieces are enough to feel the pressure gathering, like a storm far out at sea that the harbour can already smell before the clouds arrive. The name Sea Peoples has a way of taking over the imagination. It sounds like a single enemy, a shadow fleet, a mysterious confederation rising from the horizon at the exact moment the Bronze Age world begins to burn. It gives the collapse a face, or at least the outline of one ship's, warriors, strange helmets, displaced families, coastal raids, kingdoms shaken by newcomers from beyond the familiar map. For a mystery as large as 1177 BC, the idea is tempting because it feels almost tidy. A world falls, therefore someone must have decked it down. But the deeper the evidence is examined, the less tidy the Sea Peoples become. The phrase itself is modern. Ancient Egyptian inscriptions do not present these groups as a neat ethnic category with a single origin and a unified purpose. Instead, the Egyptian records name several peoples, some known from earlier sources, some still debated, and place them inside royal stories of threat and victory. They appear especially in the inscriptions and reliefs of Ramesses III, where Egypt presents itself as the great survivor, the land that holds back chaos when other lands have fallen. These texts are among the most famous pieces of evidence for the end of the Bronze Age, and they are invaluable. They are also dangerous if read too simply. Egyptian royal inscriptions are not newspaper reports. They are political monuments, theological statements, and acts of royal self-presentation. The pharaoh must appear victorious because order itself is supposed to flow through him. In the reliefs at Medinet Habu, the danger is carved with dramatic clarity. Ships clash. Foreign warriors are shown with distinctive clothing and equipment. Egypt's enemies are defeated before the eyes of gods and subjects. The message is not subtle. Ramesses III has protected the land. The forces threatening the world have been stopped at Egypt's borders. Yet every carved victory is also a confession of anxiety. A king does not need to present himself as the saviour of the order unless disorder feels close. The inscriptions speak of lands thrown into turmoil, of groups moving by land and sea, of political landscapes being overturned. Scholars still debate how much of this is literal, how much is formulaic, and how much is exaggerated for royal effect. But the fear behind the monument is difficult to dismiss. The names attached to the Sea Peoples are part of the puzzle paliset. Jekka, Shekelesh, Denien, Weshesh, and others in different contexts. Some have been linked, cautiously, to later or nearby peoples. The paliset are often associated with the Philistines, who appear in the southern Levant in the early Iron Age, and show cultural connections that may include Aegean elements. The Denaian have sometimes been connected to groups known from other traditions. The Shekelesh have been linked by some to Sicily. Though such identifications are uncertain, these associations can be intriguing, but they can also become traps. Similar sounding names are not proof. Migration is not always invasion. Cultural influence does not always mean mass population replacement. What survives in the record suggests movement and mixture, but the exact origins of many groups remain contested. The popular image of the Sea Peoples as a single invading horde sweeping across the eastern Mediterranean is therefore too simple. Some may have been raiders, some may have been migrants, some may have been mercenaries formerly employed by the very kingdoms they later threatened. Some may have been displaced communities searching for land, food, or security in a world where old systems had failed them. Some may have acted in organised military groups, while others moved with households, animals, ships, and whatever property could be carried. No single label can comfortably contain all of them. Even the word peoples may hide a messier reality, coalitions formed by necessity, opportunity, and desperation. This is where the Bronze Age collapse becomes more unsettling than a simple invasion story. If the Sea Peoples were only external attackers, the mystery would be harsh but straightforward. Instead, they may have been both cause and symptom. They may have helped destroy cities, disrupt trade, and weaken states. But their movements may also have been produced by the same pressures that were already damaging the great kingdom's drought: famine, political instability, economic breakdown, and the collapse of palace employment. A warrior without a patron can become a mercenary, a raider, or a migrant defender of his own group. A sailor whose trade routes have failed can become part of a more dangerous kind of movement. A community pushed out of one region can become the crisis of another. The evidence remains incomplete, partly because mobile people are difficult for archaeology to capture. Palaces leave archives, temples leave monuments, fortified cities leave destruction layers. But groups on the move leave scattered traces: pottery styles, burial customs, weapons, settlement changes, loan words, genetic hints in some contexts, and references written by their enemies. Most of what is known about the Sea Peoples comes from states that feared them or fought them. That means the record is tilted toward conflict. It tells us less about how these groups understood themselves, why they moved, what they had lost, or whether they saw their own actions as invasion, survival, opportunity, or return. There is a lesser-known complication in the fact that some groups named among the Sea Peoples appear in earlier records, before the final collapse. This suggests that not all of them suddenly emerge from nowhere. Some may already have been part of the diplomatic, military, or maritime world of the late Bronze Age. They may have served as mercenaries, traders, pirates, or peripheral powers long before they became famous as agents of destruction. If that is true, then the crisis did not simply arrive from outside the system. It grew partly from people already connected to the system, already moving through its roots, already familiar with its weaknesses. Egypt's confrontation with these groups does not prove that the same pattern explains every destruction elsewhere. A burned city in Anatolia, a ruined palace in Greece, and a threatened border in Egypt may belong to overlapping crises without sharing one direct cause. Some sites show evidence consistent with violent destruction. Others suggest abandonment or gradual decline. Some regions change culturally in ways that may indicate incoming populations, but the scale and nature of those movements remain debated. These Sea Peoples are real in the sense that Egyptian sources describe named groups involved in conflict and movement, but as a total explanation for the Bronze Age collapse, they are not enough. This is not to reduce their importance. For people living in coastal cities, a fleet of hostile or desperate newcomers would not feel like an abstract symptom of systems collapse. It would feel immediate. Watchmen would scan the water. Officials would worry about walls, gates, soldiers, grain, and ships. Merchants would hear rumours in harbours before inland elites fully understood them. A city that had grown wealthy by openness might suddenly find openness terrifying. The same sea that once glittered with exchange could become a road for danger. Still, the Sea People's problem refuses to become simple, and that refusal is useful. It forces the story away from a single villain and toward a wider question. What kind of world produces so much movement at once? What kind of political order leaves so many armed people available for disruption? What kind of economic network turns the fall of one region into the instability of another? The answer lies not in one fleet, one battle, or one inscription, but in the strained connections of the entire Late Bronze Age. So the mysterious warriors remain at the edge of the story, not as ghosts invented by modern imagination, but as real and disputed figures moving through a world already cracking. They are carved on Egyptian walls because Egypt survives long enough to carve them. Other cities, less fortunate, leave only ashes, broken gates, and tablets that stop before explaining who arrived. The horizon darkens, and ships become symbols of everything the age cannot control: trade, migration, fear, hunger, ambition, and the final movement of people through the ruins of a failing world. Long before the last walls burn, the weather may already be changing, not in a single apocalyptic afternoon, not as one storm sweeping over the whole eastern Mediterranean, but as a slow tightening of the sky. Rains become less dependable. Growing seasons become less generous. Marginal lands, always the first to feel stress, begin to fail more often. Wells and springs matter more. Grain stores empty faster. A palace that once planned from harvest to harvest now has to think in terms of shortage. And shortage is one of the few forces in history that can move silently through every level of society at once. Drought is difficult to see in ruins because it does not leave a spear point in a doorway or a smashed gate in a wall. It leaves signs in other archives, pollen trapped in sediments, chemical signals in lake beds, tree ring patterns, changes in crop remains, abandoned settlements, and written references to famine or food stress. These clues do not speak with one voice, and scholars still debate the scale, timing, and regional variation of late Bronze Age climate change. But the evidence increasingly suggests that parts of the eastern Mediterranean experienced a period of aridity around the centuries of collapse. The rain did not need to disappear everywhere. It only needed to become unreliable enough, for long enough, in enough places, to weaken a world that depended on surplus. Surplus is the quiet foundation of palace civilization. The walls, the scribes, the chariots, the bronze weapons, the luxury trade, the diplomatic gifts, the temple rituals, even the royal confidence carved into stone, all depend on the existence of more food than immediate survival requires. Grain feeds workers who are not farming. It supports soldiers, sailors, priests, craft specialists, messengers, and labourers attached to palace projects. It pays loyalty in the form of rations. It fills storerooms that make the ruler appear capable of protecting his people against uncertainty. When harvests are strong, this system can seem almost divine. When harvests fail, it becomes an argument over who eats first. The late Bronze Age world is not ignorant of famine. Ancient societies know hunger intimately. They store food, manage fields, pray for rain, use irrigation where possible, and build political systems partly around the promise of protection from scarcity. Egypt, with the Nile, has a special advantage, though even Egypt can suffer when larger regional systems strain around it. Other lands are more exposed to rainfall patterns that vary sharply from year to year. In Anatolia, Syria, Canaan, Cyprus, and the Aegean, a few bad seasons can place enormous pressure on communities already tied to tribute demands, military obligations, and elite consumption. A single poor harvest is a crisis. Repeated poor harvests are something else. They do not merely reduce food, they reduce trust. Farmers may hide grain from collectors. Local elites may resist sending tribute to distant capitals. Palace officials may have to choose between feeding dependent workers, supplying soldiers, honouring temples, maintaining diplomacy, and preserving royal stores. If grain must be imported, then trade routes become not just profitable, but essential. If the sea is unsafe or ports are threatened, hunger deepens. If neighbouring regions are also short of food, there may be nowhere easy to buy relief. Drought, in this sense, does not act alone. It turns every other problem into a sharper blade. This is one reason the climate question matters so much to the Bronze Age collapse. It does not require imagining climate as a simple master cause, pressing a button and ending kingdoms. No single explanation fully accounts for this. Instead, drought may have acted as a stress multiplier. It weakens the body before the wound. It makes armies harder to feed, workers harder to control, trade more urgent, diplomacy more tense, and migration more likely. It may push people from dry zones toward better watered regions, where their arrival can create new political anxieties. It may make raiding more attractive and defence more expensive. It may make rulers look less legitimate, not because they caused the dry years, but because kingship is judged by the ability to maintain order when the gods, the fields, and the roads are uncooperative. There is a strange, almost unfair quality to drought as a historical force. A king can march against an enemy. He can punish rebellion, negotiate marriage alliances, send gifts, repair walls, build ships, and command scribes to record abundance, but he cannot command rain. He can store grain from good years, but storage has limits. He can import food, but imports depend on ships, merchants, safe routes, and partners who have enough to spare. He can stage rituals, and those rituals may comfort people. But rituals do not fill a granary if the fields fail again. The palace, so strong in the world of records, becomes vulnerable before something that cannot be sealed, counted, or ordered into obedience. The human experience of this would be slow and intimate. Bread becomes smaller. Oil becomes more precious. Animals are slaughtered earlier than planned because fodder is scarce. Fields that once seemed reliable begin to look uncertain. People watch clouds with a seriousness that modern life can dull but never erase. The sound of rain on a roof becomes more than weather. It becomes relief, perhaps even mercy. In palace centres, officials keep records and make decisions. In smaller communities, families adjust, save, trade, move, or appeal to local authorities. The evidence remains incomplete, especially for ordinary people. But the pattern of stress is not hard to imagine, because agrarian societies live close to the edge even in good times. Drought can also change the meaning of distance. In a wealthy, stable age, distance is opportunity. It means exotic goods, foreign marriages, copper from Cyprus, tin from far away, timber from one coast, ivory from another, and diplomatic gifts glittering in royal halls. In a hungry age, distance becomes danger. Every mile between a city and its food supply matters. Every harbour becomes a question. Every delayed shipment becomes more than inconvenience. If a palace has grown accustomed to drawing resources from a wide network, then a climate-driven shortage exposes the cost of that dependence. The world that once seemed spacious begins to feel stretched thin. Some scholars emphasize written signs of famine in the Late Bronze Age, including appeals and references to grain shortages in regions connected to the collapsing system. Others caution that famine texts can be local, formulaic, or difficult to date precisely. Both points matter. The responsible picture is not one of total starvation everywhere, but of uneven, repeated stress in a region already vulnerable to political and economic disruption. What survives in the record suggests that food anxiety was part of the atmosphere of the age. It may not explain every burning palace, but it helps explain why so many palaces were less able to absorb shocks that earlier generations might have survived. The important thing is timing. A drought does not need to kill a civilization directly. It only needs to arrive when the civilization is already complex, centralized, dependent on surplus, and tied to distant trade. It only needs to reduce the margin of safety. The late Bronze Age kingdoms had weathered wars before. They had known rivalry, succession problems, diplomatic insults, border conflicts, and local disasters. What makes the collapse different is the possibility that these familiar problems began arriving under worse environmental conditions, with less surplus to soften them and more desperate movement across the map. So behind the famous images of sea peoples, burning cities, and fallen palaces, there may be another scene, quieter and more devastating fields under a dry sky, harvests that do not meet expectation, storehouses open too often, officials recalculating what can no longer be promised. The Bronze Age does not fall because rain stops in one dramatic moment. It weakens as the old balance between land, labour, food, and power becomes harder to maintain. The sky withdraws a little. The soil answers poorly, and the palaces, which had learned to govern people, discover that they have never truly governed the climate. If drought is the crisis that creeps through fields and storerooms, earthquake is the crisis that arrives without negotiation. It gives no warning that a scribe can enter properly into an archive, no diplomatic signal, no hostile fleet on the horizon, no season of watching clouds fail. The ground itself moves. Walls that have stood for generations loosen in a few breaths. Columns shift. Doorways twist. Roofs fall into rooms where jars, tools, tablets, and furniture have been arranged with ordinary confidence. In a world built from mud brick, stone, timber, plaster, and faith in permanence, the earth can become an enemy no army can outmarch. The eastern Mediterranean is a restless region. Anatolia, the Aegean, the Levant, Cyprus, and surrounding zones sit within a wider landscape of faults, shifting plates, mountain building, and seismic risk. Ancient people did not need modern geology to know that the ground could betray them. They experienced tremors, collapses, cracked walls, fallen buildings, landslides, damaged springs, and the frightening aftershocks that make even open ground feel unsafe. But archaeology sees earthquakes imperfectly. A toppled wall may suggest seismic movement, yet walls also fall after fire, abandonment, warfare, poor repair, or later disturbance. A crushed room may look dramatic, but drama is not diagnosis. Scholars still debate how much earthquakes contributed to the Bronze Age collapse, and the evidence remains incomplete from site to site. One influential idea is that the late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean may have suffered a kind of earthquake storm, a sequence of major seismic events occurring over decades rather than one single disaster. This is not the same as imagining the entire world shaking at once. It means that multiple cities, already under stress, could have been damaged by earthquakes close enough in time to strain recovery. In a wealthy, stable period, a city can rebuild after a tremor. Labour can be mobilized. Timber can be brought in. Food can be supplied to workers. Walls can be repaired. Temples can be restored. The disaster becomes part of the city's memory, but not its end. In a collapsing period, the same damage can become irreversible, because the networks needed for repair are already failing. This is the crucial difference between destruction and collapse. A palace can burn and be rebuilt if the political system survives. A wall can crack and be repaired if the labour force is available. A city can lose a quarter of its buildings and recover if grain, wood, stone, metal, leadership, and confidence remain. But if an earthquake damages a city during drought, trade disruption, political unrest, and military danger, repair becomes more than architecture. It becomes a test of the whole system. Can the palace still command workers? Can it feed them? Can it acquire timber? Can it protect the site while walls are weak? Can it persuade people that the centre is still worth serving? If the answer is no, the earthquake is not merely a natural disaster. It becomes a trigger that exposes a deeper failure. The archaeological problem is made harder by fire. Many famous destruction layers from the end of the Bronze Age include burning, and fire can follow many causes. Attackers burn cities. Defenders burn structures accidentally in chaos. Earthquakes knock over lamps, hearths, and braziers. Storage rooms catch fire. Wooden beams ignite. A building damaged by tremors may burn because people cannot control the flames quickly enough. Later inhabitants may clear, reuse, or disturb the remains, making the original sequence difficult to read. When excavators find collapsed masonry, ash, broken pottery, and abandoned objects, they must ask whether they are seeing war, earthquake, accidental fire, or a layered catastrophe in which one event opened the door to another. This matters because humans naturally want ruins to tell a clean story. A burned palace feels like conquest. A collapsed wall feels like earthquake. An abandoned settlement feels like famine. But ancient ruins often preserve consequences more clearly than causes. At one site, there may be signs consistent with violent destruction. At another, seismic damage may be more likely. At a third, the evidence may be ambiguous. Across the Late Bronze Age, the pattern is not uniform. That unevenness is not a weakness in the story. It is the story. The collapse is not a single event with one footprint. It is a landscape of failures, each with its own local path into the wider darkness. Imagine a palace centre after a major tremor. The outer walls may still stand in places, but cracks run through them. Roofs have fallen in administrative rooms. Storerooms are compromised. Jars of oil break, and oil feeds fire. Granaries may be damaged. Sacred spaces need purification or repair. Roads into the city may be blocked by debris. People gather in open areas, uncertain whether to return indoors. Officials try to assess damage while aftershocks continue. In ordinary circumstances, orders go out, workers are summoned, supplies are counted, the palace turns disaster into administration. But in the years around 1177 BC, administration itself may already be strained. A damaged palace trying to repair a damaged city in a damaged world faces a cruel arithmetic. There is also the psychological dimension, harder to prove but impossible to ignore. Ancient kingship is tied to cosmic order. Temples, palaces, walls, and rituals all express the idea that the world has structure and that rulers stand near its centre. When the earth shakes and sacred buildings crack, the symbolism is powerful. People may interpret disaster through the language of divine anger, ritual failure, bad omens, or broken order. Modern archaeology cannot easily measure fear, but it can recognize that political authority depends partly on confidence. If drought has already raised questions about the ruler's ability to secure abundance, and raids have raised questions about protection, then earthquakes can make the world feel as if even the ground has withdrawn its loyalty. Some proposed examples of earthquake damage in the Late Bronze Age world include sites in the Aegean, Anatolia, Cyprus, and the Levant, though each case must be treated carefully. Walls shifted from their foundations, buildings collapsed in ways that may suggest seismic motion, and patterns of destruction sometimes look different from straightforward military burning. Yet caution is necessary. Earthquakes are attractive explanations because they are dramatic and because the region is seismically active, but not every collapsed structure is evidence of a tremor. Responsible interpretation requires comparing architecture, debris patterns, repair phases, burning, artifact positions, and regional geological data. What survives in the record suggests earthquakes may have been part of the crisis, but they do not replace other causes. The most persuasive role for earthquakes is not as a lone destroyer of the Bronze Age, but as another pressure in the cascade. A city damaged by earthquake becomes more vulnerable to attack. A harbour disrupted by seismic damage may handle trade poorly. A palace whose storerooms are destroyed loses supplies just when it needs them most. A community forced to rebuild may consume surplus that had been meant for soldiers, tribute, diplomacy, or famine relief. If multiple centres suffer such damage across a few generations, the cost of repair spreads through the system. The Bronze Age world is wealthy, but its wealth is not infinite. It is tied up in movement, obligation, storage, and trust. There is a quiet irony in the monumental architecture of the age. The same walls built to project permanence can become deadly burdens when the ground shakes. The same packed storerooms that demonstrate royal wealth can become fuel and rubble. The same administrative buildings that organize the kingdom can, when destroyed, erase the very capacity to respond. Earthquake turns strength into weight. Fire turns storage into danger. Collapse turns centralization into a point of failure. By itself, an earthquake is an event. Inside a strained system, it becomes something larger. It interrupts repair, exposes weakness, drains surplus, frightens populations, damages symbols, and leaves ruins that later generations may misread as purely human violence. The Bronze Age mystery is not solved by the shaking ground, but the shaking ground belongs inside the mystery. It reminds us that ancient collapse is not always a story of enemies and decisions. Sometimes the world breaks because stone, soil, timber, weather, hunger, fear, and politics meet in the same unlucky generation. And when the fires finally rise from the broken rooms, it may be impossible, even thousands of years later, to say where the disaster truly began in the hands of attackers, in the failures of kings, in the dry sky, or in the earth itself. A trade route does not collapse with the drama of a burning palace. It fails first as absence. A ship that should have appeared at the harbour mouth is late. A merchant who usually brings copper has nothing to sell. A caravan arrives with fewer animals, fewer ingots, fewer assurances. A royal workshop asks for bronze and receives excuses. A palace scribe records what is available, and the numbers quietly reveal that the world beyond the city is no longer behaving as expected. For a long time, the Bronze Age system has treated distance as something that can be managed through treaties, ports, roads, envoys, and habit. But when the roots begin to snap, distance becomes powerful again. Bronze itself is the simplest way to see the danger. Copper and tin are not evenly distributed across the lands that need them. A sword in a Mycenaean palace, a tool in a Levantine workshop, a fitting on a chariot, a ceremonial vessel in a temple, or a weapon stored for soldiers may contain a hidden geography of mines, ships, middlemen, and political permissions. The object looks solid, local, finished. Its history is not local at all. It is a chain. Somewhere, miners dig ore from the earth. Somewhere else, people smelt, carry, weigh, trade, and rework it. Harbours receive it. Officials tax it. Scribes note it. Craftsmen transform it. Elites display it. Soldiers depend on it. If one part of that chain fails, the finished world begins to feel the break. Tin is especially important because it is elusive. The exact routes by which tin reached the eastern Mediterranean remain debated, and scholars still work with chemical analysis, shipwreck cargoes, texts, and distribution patterns to reconstruct what ancient merchants themselves may have known practically rather than scientifically. Some tin likely travelled from far beyond the immediate palace world, perhaps through long overland and maritime networks where goods changed hands many times before reaching a royal storehouse. That means a crisis far from the palace could arrive in disguised form as a shortage of alloy. A king did not need to know every mountain pass and market between his capital and the tin source to suffer when the flow weakened. Copper from Cyprus gives the story a clearer shape. Because Cyprus is a central supplier and a maritime crossroads, oxhide ingots, named for their shape resembling stretched hides, move through Bronze Age trade and appear in shipwrecks and archaeological contexts across the region. They are practical for transport, recognizable as units of metal, and strangely beautiful in their simplicity. One of the most famous windows into this trade comes from the Uluburun shipwreck, dated earlier than the final collapse but revealing the astonishing complexity of late Bronze Age exchange. Its cargo included copper ingots, tin, glass ingots, ivory, ebony, resins, luxury goods, weapons, tools, and personal items from multiple cultural spheres. It was not a poor little boat creeping along the coast with a few jars. It was a floating museum of international connection. That ship went down before the great final crisis, but it shows what was at stake. The Bronze Age sea is not empty space between civilizations. It is part of the machinery of civilization. Cargoes do not merely enrich kings, they allow elite systems to function. Metal feeds workshops. Luxury goods feed diplomacy and status. Raw materials become gifts, payments, temple offerings, military equipment, and symbols of legitimacy. If the sea becomes unsafe, or if ports burn, or if merchants lose confidence, the problem spreads inland. A ruler far from the coast may still discover that his authority depends on maritime stability. Grain is another lifeline, less glamorous than copper or ivory but more dangerous when missing. Food moves through local and regional systems, and in times of shortage it can become the most important trade good of all. Egypt, when harvests are strong, can appear as a place of relative abundance, and other regions may look toward grain shipments as relief. But grain trade depends on ships, storage, political agreements, and safe passage. A famine in one zone can be softened by imports if another zone has surplus, and if transport continues. If several regions are stressed at once, or if insecurity interrupts shipping, shortage becomes harder to contain. Hunger localizes fear, but trade failure internationalizes it. The palace economies described earlier are particularly exposed to this. Their administrators are skilled at recording and allocating goods, but they cannot allocate what never arrives. A shortage of metal may force difficult choices, repair tools or equip soldiers, honor diplomatic obligations or preserve local stores, maintain elite display or support practical production. A shortage of grain may be even more destabilizing because it touches workers, soldiers, dependents, and ordinary households directly. A shortage of timber can delay shipbuilding, roof repairs, and monumental construction. A shortage of prestige goods can weaken diplomatic language. because gifts are not decorative extras in this world. They are part of how rank and trust are performed. This is one of the lesser seen sides of collapse, the failure of expectation. For generations, elites know what kinds of goods should circulate. They know what a proper gift looks like, what materials a palace should command, what imports mark high status, what supplies a workshop should receive, and what foreign contacts should be maintained. When those expectations are frustrated repeatedly, the old social signals begin to flicker. A king who cannot provide bronze, food, or gifts may still claim divine favour, but his claim becomes harder to believe. A vassal who receives less protection and fewer rewards may reconsider loyalty. A craftsman attached to palace production may find the raw materials gone. A merchant may avoid risky routes or turn to more violent opportunities. The network does not need to vanish all at once. It only needs to become unreliable enough to make everyone act defensively. Trade also carries information, and the loss of trade means the loss of knowledge. Ships bring rumours as surely as they bring cargo. Merchants know which ports are safe, which rulers are in trouble, which roads are blocked, where prices are rising, and where danger is growing. In a functioning world, that information helps the system adjust. In a failing world, information itself can become panic. News of one destroyed city may make sailors avoid a route, which deepens shortages elsewhere, which weakens another city, which creates new danger. No single explanation fully accounts for this, because the network is not passive. It reacts to fear, and those reactions create consequences of their own. The snapping of roots would not look identical everywhere. Some local communities may become more self-sufficient and survive with fewer imported goods. Some inland areas may suffer less immediately than ports. Some merchants may profit from scarcity, finding new routes or charging higher prices. Some elites may hoard metal or recycle older bronze objects. Archaeologists sometimes find signs of changing metal use, altered settlement patterns, and shifts in imported pottery or luxury goods. Though the evidence remains incomplete and varies by region, collapse is not simply a darkness falling over every road. It is a reorganization of movement, where old highways of wealth become uncertain paths. For the great palaces, however, the decline of long-distance exchange is devastating because their prestige has been built on reach. They are not merely local storehouses. They are centres that claim access to a wider world. Foreign goods in their rooms prove that claim. Diplomatic gifts prove that claim. Bronze proves that claim. When the flow weakens, the palace becomes more provincial, more anxious, and more dependent on immediate resources. The grand international age begins to shrink. There is something almost eerie in imagining the final years from the viewpoint of a harbour. The sea still looks the same. Dawn still rises over the water. Gulls still move above the masts. Warehouses still stand, and officials still expect arrivals. But fewer ships come from the old directions. Some carry bad news. Some carry people who are not merchants. Some never return at all. The sea has not changed its colour, but its meaning has changed. It is no longer the confident road of bronze. Grain and royal gifts. It is a widening uncertainty, and along its routes the old world begins to lose the habit of connection. When trade weakens and harvests fail, people do not remain still simply because maps later prefer them that way. They move. Some move with permission, under orders, as soldiers, sailors, labourers, envoys, or merchants. Some move because their old protectors can no longer protect them. Some move because a dry landscape has made survival harder than the road. Some move armed because the road itself has become dangerous. and in a collapsing world the difference between a migrant, a mercenary, a raider, and a refugee can become blurred by hunger, opportunity, and fear. The Late Bronze Age crisis is not only a story of kings losing power, it is also a story of movement, and movement is one of the hardest things for archaeology to interpret. The official records of great states usually see moving people as a problem. Egyptian inscriptions, Hittite documents, and palace archives are written from the viewpoint of order. They care about borders, tribute, obligations, labour, and obedience. A group that does not stay where the state expects it to stay becomes suspicious. A band of armed men outside normal command becomes a threat. A displaced population looking for land may be described not in terms of suffering, but in terms of danger. This does not mean the danger was imaginary. It means the surviving records often show moving people through the eyes of rulers who fear them. The Eastern Mediterranean before the collapse already contains many kinds of mobility. Soldiers serve far from home. Some foreign warriors are employed by states that later describe similar outsiders as enemies. Sailors know coastlines better than kings do. Traders pass between ports, learning languages, prices, and weaknesses. Pastoral groups move with animals according to seasonal needs. Craftsmen and specialists may be relocated by royal order. Royal marriages move women between courts as instruments of alliance. Captives and dependent workers can be shifted by victorious states. Movement is woven into the Bronze Age system long before collapse. The crisis does not invent mobility, it changes its meaning. As central powers weaken, the same mobile skills that once served the system can turn against it. A sailor who understands harbours can raid them. A mercenary familiar with palace defences can fight for whoever pays. A displaced group that knows coastal routes can search for settlement by sea. A local ruler who once obeyed an empire may take advantage of imperial distraction. Borderlands, always harder to control than capitals pretend, become more active. The palace world has depended on people moving in organised ways, under authority. When authority weakens, movement becomes less predictable, and unpredictability is terrifying to states built on records and commands. This is where fear begins to travel faster than armies. A report arrives that a city has been attacked. Another says a group is moving along the coast. Another warns that ships have been seen. It may be true, exaggerated, late, or misunderstood. In a stable world, officials can verify, respond, and reassure. In a strained world, rumour itself becomes a force. Merchants avoid a dangerous harbour. Farmers near a road hide supplies. Local elites strengthen their own defences rather than send resources to a distant palace. Soldiers are called away from one frontier to guard another. Every precaution taken by one community may deepen the insecurity of another. Fear changes behaviour, and behaviour changes history. The collapse is sometimes imagined as a clean wave of invasion because that image is easy to visualise. But the archaeological and textual evidence suggests something more tangled. There are certainly signs of violence in many places. Destruction layers, weapons, emergency measures, and royal inscriptions all point to conflict as a real part of the story. Yet not every destruction has the same cause, and not every movement of people is an invasion. Some groups may have arrived after palaces had already failed, settling into spaces opened by collapse rather than causing it directly. Others may have been part of the violence itself. Scholars still debate the scale of migrations, the identities of different groups, and how much cultural change reflects new populations rather than local adaptation. The appearance of new cultural patterns after the collapse adds to the mystery. In the southern Levant, The early Philistine settlements show material links that many scholars associate with Aegean or Eastern Mediterranean connections, including distinctive pottery styles and food habits. But these communities do not remain foreign replicas. They become part of the local world, changing over generations, mixing, adapting, and forming new identities. That is a crucial point. Migration in the ancient world rarely means one people replacing another in a simple block. It often means communities arriving, intermarrying, borrowing, abandoning some customs, preserving others, and being transformed by the land they enter. What survives in the record suggests movement and mixture, not a single frozen ethnic story. The same may be true elsewhere. Groups known in Egyptian texts may include warriors from different origins joined by circumstance. Some may have been uprooted by disasters in the Aegean, Anatolia, Cyprus, or the central Mediterranean. Some may have moved in search of food or land. Some may have joined larger coalitions because a collapsing system leaves fewer peaceful options. A person who begins as a farmer in a failing region can become a migrant. A migrant under threat can become armed. An armed migrant denied entry can become an attacker. A defeated attacker can be settled by a victorious state as a controlled population. The categories shift with fortune. For palace societies, this kind of movement is destabilizing because it attacks the old assumption that people belong in known places. Administration depends on predictability. Fields have assigned producers, workers have assigned tasks, vassals have assigned duties, soldiers have assigned commanders, merchants have expected routes. When people move outside those categories, the system loses grip. It is not only that newcomers may fight, it is that they make the world harder to count. They arrive without fitting into the tablets. The human landscape of the collapse would therefore be crowded with unease. Fortified towns watch roads and coastlines. Palace officials try to mobilize defenders while still maintaining food supplies. Villages hear that distant centers have burned and wonder whether the danger will come closer. Some communities choose flight before violence reaches them. Others negotiate, pay, resist, or join stronger groups. The evidence remains incomplete, especially for those who left few written records. But the pattern is familiar across history. When large systems fail, people do not simply disappear. They scatter, cluster, improvise, and sometimes harden into new political forces. This movement also helps explain why collapse can spread. A destroyed city produces survivors, unpaid fighters, lost markets, and vacant routes. A failed harvest pushes people toward better regions. A weakened empire loses control of vassals, who then pursue their own interests. A raiding group may become stronger by absorbing others. A defensive mobilization in one place may strip another place of protection. In this way, movement becomes both consequence and cause. It is generated by instability, then generates more instability. Yet there is no need to imagine the people on the move as faceless chaos. Many were likely ordinary communities facing impossible choices, trying to preserve households, status, gods, skills, and memory under worsening conditions. Some became violent. Some were victims of violence. Some founded new settlements. Some entered the service of surviving powers. Some vanished into the archaeology of local populations. The moral simplicity of invasion narratives cannot hold them all. The late Bronze Age world is not divided neatly between civilized victims and barbarian destroyers. It is a stressed human landscape in which the categories themselves are collapsing. By the time Egypt carves its victories and coastal cities leave their burned archives behind, movement has become one of the defining signs of the age. Ships no longer guarantee trade. Roads no longer guarantee tribute. Armed groups no longer necessarily belong to kings. The old powers face not one enemy, but a mobile uncertainty produced by the failure of the very networks that once made the Bronze Age rich. Fear travels with the migrants, ahead of the warriors, behind the refugees, and through the minds of rulers who realize that the world is no longer staying where the tablets placed it. Egypt does not vanish in the flames that consume so many other Bronze Age centers. That alone can make it seem like the exception, the great survivor standing firm while the world around it breaks. Its temples still rise, its scribes still write, its kings still claim cosmic authority. The Nile still runs through the land with an ancient steadiness that no foreign fleet can easily interrupt. But survival is not the same as unchanged strength. Egypt passes through the crisis like a man crossing a burning bridge alive on the far side, but carrying smoke in his lungs, with the road behind him gone. In the story of 1177 BC, the Egyptian evidence is both essential and misleading. Essential because Egypt leaves some of the most vivid records of the crisis, especially under Ramesses III, whose inscriptions and reliefs present him as the ruler who defeats enemies arriving by land and sea. Misleading because those records speak in the language of royal victory. They are meant to magnify the pharaoh, to show him as the defender of order against chaos, to assure gods and humans that Egypt remains the center of the world. The reliefs are not neutral battlefield reports. They are monuments with a purpose. Still, even propaganda can preserve real fear. The more urgently a king proclaims that he has saved order, the more clearly one senses that order has been threatened. Egypt's advantage begins with geography. The Nile Valley is long, fertile, and protected by deserts on both sides. It is not impossible to invade, as Egyptian history proves many times. But it is harder to destabilize than the open coastal corridors of the Levant or the palace networks of the Aegean. Egypt can feed itself more reliably than many neighbors when the river behaves well. Its population is concentrated along a narrow, administratively legible landscape. Its traditions of kingship are deep, its bureaucracy experienced, its temples wealthy, and its symbolic language of stability extraordinarily powerful. In a world of failing palaces, Egypt has one of the strongest old machines still running. Yet that machine is under strain. The new kingdom has spent centuries projecting power beyond the Nile, especially into the Levant. Egyptian influence depends on garrisons, local client rulers, tribute, trade, and the ability to make foreign lands acknowledge pharaonic superiority. This is not effortless. It requires soldiers, supplies, diplomacy, and confidence. When the eastern Mediterranean destabilizes, Egypt's outer world becomes more expensive to hold. The collapse of neighboring systems does not simply remove rivals. It removes the structured environment through which Egypt has long exercised power. A broken vassal landscape can be more troublesome than a stable enemy, because there is no single authority to negotiate with and no predictable order to dominate. Ramesses III inherits and inhabits this dangerous moment. His reign is often remembered as one of the last great flashes of New Kingdom power. He presents himself as a warrior king, a restorer, a defender against Libyans in the west and against the groups later called Sea Peoples in the north and east. In the great scenes at Medinet Habu, Egypt's enemies are trapped, defeated, and displayed within the ordered frame of royal art. Their ships are crowded and chaotic. Egypt's forces are controlled and purposeful. The pharaoh stands above the confusion, the human guarantee that the land of the Nile will not share the fate of others. The imagery is powerful because it tells two stories at once. On the surface, it tells of victory. Beneath that, it tells of proximity. The crisis has come close enough to be carved in stone. Egypt is not watching the collapse from a safe distance. It is fighting at its edge. The inscriptions speak of foreign lands being unsettled, of groups advancing, of peoples whose movements seem to follow the breakdown of older states. Scholars still debate the roots, identities, and scale of these groups, and the Egyptian account compresses events into a royal narrative. But what survives in the record suggests that Egypt confronts a real and serious danger during a period when many neighbouring powers are failing. The battles themselves, as Egypt presents them, are not merely military events. They are ideological events. In Egyptian thought, the pharaoh's duty is to maintain Ma'at order, balance, truth, rightness against chaos. Foreign enemies are often depicted as chaos, but during the Bronze Age collapse, that old formula gains new force. The world outside Egypt really does appear unstable. Cities destroyed, kingdoms weaken, migrations increase, trade falters. In this setting, the pharaoh's claim to preserve order is not only ceremonial, it becomes the central political promise of the state. But victory has costs that monuments do not easily admit. Defending borders costs grain, labour, metals, ships, and men. Maintaining armies during a period of regional disruption strains the economy. If trade routes falter, materials become harder to secure. If Egyptian holdings in Canaan are weakened or lost, the flow of tribute and influence contracts. If displaced groups must be defeated, settled, or managed, victory becomes administration. The pharaoh may win battles and still lose the wider world that made those battles meaningful. Egypt survives the invaders, but it cannot restore the Bronze Age international order that is collapsing around it. This is one of the most important lessons of Egypt's survival. A state can win and decline at the same time. It can defeat an enemy at the border while losing access to old trade networks. It can keep its capital and temples while its empire shrinks. It can continue writing records while the value of those records changes. It can preserve the image of eternal kingship while the material base of kingship erodes. No single explanation fully accounts for Egypt's later weakening. But the crisis of the early 12th century belongs inside the longer story of New Kingdom decline. There are signs of stress within Egypt itself after this period. Labour unrest, including the famous later strike by workers at Deir el-Medina during the reign of Rameses III, reveals that even in the pharaoh's own land, the machinery of payment and supply can fail. These workers are skilled people attached to royal tomb building, not vague figures on the edge of society. When rations are delayed, they protest in a way that is startlingly human across the centuries. The detail is surprising because it punctures the image of Egypt as a perfectly obedient civilization. Even under one of the last powerful New Kingdom rulers, the state can struggle to meet obligations to those who serve it. This does not mean Egypt collapses in the same way as Ugarit or Mycenaean Palace Greece. It does not. Its institutions continue. Its writing traditions endure. Its temples remain centres of wealth and identity. Its people adapt within an old cultural framework that proves remarkably resilient. But Egypt after the crisis is increasingly a more inward-looking power. Its grip on the Levant weakens over time. Its ability to dominate the Eastern Mediterranean world is reduced. Later rulers inherit grandeur, but also limitation. The empire becomes memory faster than the civilization itself does. In that sense, Egypt is the perfect survivor for this story because it shows that collapse is not always a clean death. Sometimes it is a narrowing. The borders contract, the ambitions shrink, the diplomatic world grows poorer, the flow of goods becomes less spectacular. The old claims continue, but they echo inside smaller rooms. A temple wall may still show the pharaoh towering over enemies, but beyond the carved scene, the age of great kings exchanging gifts across a stable international system is fading. The Nile continues to shine in the sun. Farmers still work the fields. Priests still serve the gods. Scribes still write with practiced hands. Egypt remains Egypt, and that continuity is extraordinary. Yet the world around it has changed in ways no victory relief can reverse. The Hittite Empire is gone. Ugarit is silent. Mycenaean palaces are failing or fallen. Trade routes are uncertain. New peoples and new political forms are emerging from the wreckage. Egypt has not been swallowed by the catastrophe, but it has been pushed into a different age. So the story of Rameses III is not simply the story of the king who beat back the sea peoples. It is the story of a civilization strong enough to resist collapse, but not strong enough to prevent history from turning. Egypt stands, but it stands in a changed landscape, one where survival itself has become a form of exhaustion. The old Bronze Age world had been a chorus of palaces calling to one another across land and sea. After the crisis, fewer voices answer. Egypt's voice continues. Deep and ancient, but beyond it the silence is growing. Far to the north of Egypt's surviving temples, beyond the warm coastal routes and the ports where the Bronze Age sea carries its final rumours, the Hittite world disappears in a different way. It does not leave behind one grand Egyptian-style proclamation explaining the end. It does not carve its own final defeat into stone. Its imperial capital, Hattusa, in the highlands of Anatolia, falls silent, and silence is often harder to interpret than fire. The Hittite Empire had once been one of the great powers of the age, strong enough to confront Egypt, sophisticated enough to run archives and treaties, and wide enough to bind together many lands through vassalage, diplomacy, war, and royal command. Then, around the turn from the 13th to the 12th century BC, the imperial centre breaks apart, and one of the Bronze Age's mightiest states vanishes from history's main stage. Hattusa is not an easy capital. It stands inland, in a rugged landscape of hills, cliffs, plateaus, and cold winters, far from the soft image of a Mediterranean palace city. Its strength is carved into the terrain. Massive walls climb the slopes. Gates guarded by stone lions and sphinxes announce royal authority. Tunnels, towers, temples, storerooms, archives, and ceremonial spaces make the city feel both fortified and sacred. This is a capital built not merely to house a king, but to declare that power can impose order even on difficult land. Yet that same geography reveals the empire's constant problem. The Hittite state has to work hard to hold itself together. Its capital is impressive, but its empire is a system of managed tensions, vassal rulers, border conflicts, rival dynasties, grain needs, distant campaigns, and the fragile loyalty of regions that may obey while strength is visible and reconsider when it fades. The Hittites are sometimes remembered mainly through their rivalry with Egypt, especially the Great Battle of Kadesh in the 13th century BC, where the forces of Rameses II and the Hittite king Muwatalli II clash in one of the most famous military encounters of the ancient world. The battle itself is wrapped in royal propaganda, especially from the Egyptian side, but its aftermath reveals something more important than victory claims. Egypt and Hatti eventually make peace. They exchange diplomatic messages. They recognize each other as great powers. A royal marriage follows. The Hittite kingdom is not a barbarian obstacle in Egypt's story. It is a diplomatic equal, part of the elite club of kings who understand the language of treaties, gifts, oaths, and prestige. Yet inside the Hittite Empire, pressure is always present. Succession disputes can weaken the royal house. Vassals in western Anatolia, northern Syria, and other frontier zones require constant attention. Assyria rises as a threat in the east. The control of Syria matters deeply, not only for prestige but for access to routes, cities, and resources. Grain supply is a recurring concern, and some Hittite texts indicate that famine and food shipments were serious issues at times. Scholars still debate the exact role of drought and shortage in the empire's final decline, but what survives in the record suggests that food insecurity was not a distant abstraction. Even a great king can be humbled by the need to feed his capital. This is one of the lesser-known details that makes the Hittite collapse so revealing. The empire may have depended more on imported grain than its monumental capital suggests. Hattusa's inland highland setting was politically symbolic and defensible, but it was not the easiest place to support during crisis. If harvests failed, if transport faltered, if vassals became unreliable, or if routes were threatened, the imperial centre could face strain quickly. The capital that looked powerful in stone may have been vulnerable in bread. A wall can stop an army for a time. It cannot feed the people behind it. The final fate of Hattusa remains debated because the archaeological picture is complicated. The city shows signs of destruction and burning, but some evidence suggests it may have been partly evacuated or already declining before the final fires. This is important. The fall of Hattusa may not have been a simple surprise sack by a single enemy. It may have been the last visible stage of a longer process in which royal authority withdrew, administrative life weakened, and the city lost its ability to function as the imperial centre. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate who destroyed what, when, and why. But the disappearance of the imperial apparatus is unmistakable. The archives stop. The capital no longer commands the old world. The empire's central voice goes quiet. Possible attackers or destabilizing forces have been proposed from several directions. The Kaska peoples, long troublesome to the north, had pressured Hittite lands for generations. Western Anatolian groups may have taken advantage of weakness. The upheavals associated with the wider Bronze Age collapse may have disrupted Hittite control in Syria and along vital routes. Assyrian pressure in the east limited Hittite options. Climate stress may have worsened the food problem. Internal political instability may have made coordinated response harder. No single explanation fully accounts for this. The Hittite collapse, like the wider collapse, looks less like one blow than a convergence of blows landing on a state that had little margin left. There is a temptation to imagine an empire ending at the moment its capital burns, but empires often die unevenly. The centre fails first in the historical imagination because the centre leaves the grandest ruins. Yet power can fragment rather than disappear completely. After the fall of the Hittite imperial system, smaller Neo-Hittite and Syro-Hittite kingdoms continue in parts of Anatolia and northern Syria. They preserve elements of Hittite culture, language, art, royal symbolism, and political memory into the Iron Age. This survival is essential. Hatti as an empire vanishes, but Hittite traditions do not simply evaporate, they break into smaller vessels. That fragmentation changes the map. Where once a great king ruled from Hattusa and negotiated with Egypt, later smaller kingdoms maneuver among Assyria, Aramaean groups, local dynasties, and new regional realities. Monumental hieroglyphic Luwian inscriptions appear in some successor states, carrying forward an Anatolian tradition that outlives the imperial capital. The political scale has changed, but memory remains. Collapse here is not the end of identity. It is the loss of the structure that once gave identity imperial form. The fall of the Hittite Empire also reveals how vulnerable a large territorial state can be when its connective tissue weakens. A port city like Ugarit is exposed to the sea. A palace in Greece is exposed to the failure of its administrative network. Hatti is exposed to the burden of holding many landscapes under one crown. Its strength lies in its ability to coordinate distant regions. But that coordination depends on loyalty, roads, food, military force, and royal legitimacy. If vassals stop obeying, if grain stops moving, if enemies press multiple borders, if the capital itself loses confidence, then the empire's size becomes not a shield but a strain. There is something especially haunting about Hattusa, because it feels so deliberately permanent. The stones seem to expect a future. The gates look as though they were made for endless processions of kings, soldiers, priests, and envoys. Yet permanence in architecture can deceive. A city may be built to last, while the political relationships that sustain it are far more delicate. The Hittite capital survives as a ruin because stone endures. The empire fails because agreements, food flows. Dynastic authority and fear do not endure as easily. By the time the imperial Hittite world vanishes, the Bronze Age balance of power is broken beyond repair. Egypt survives but contracts. Ugarit is gone. The Aegean palaces falter. Northern Syria and Anatolia fragment into smaller, more local worlds. The great international conversation of kings loses one of its strongest voices. No final Hittite tablet explains the end with satisfying clarity. Instead, the silence of Hattusa becomes its own testimony. It tells of a state that had mastered war, diplomacy, fortification, and administration, yet still depended on the same fragile things as every other kingdom food: trust, roots, obedience, and time. When these began to fail together, even the walls of a mountain capital could not hold back the ending of an age. Across the Aegean, the collapse does not announce itself with one imperial capital falling silent, because Mycenaean Greece is not one empire with a single heart. It is a constellation of palace centres, each ruling its own territory, each watching its rivals, each bound into the wider Bronze Age world by trade, diplomacy, warfare, craft production, and the prestige of warrior elites: Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, Thebes, Medea, and other centres rise on hills and ridges. Their walls made from stone so large that later Greeks imagine they must have been built by Cyclopes. These places look like power made visible. Gates narrow into defensible passages. Storerooms sit behind thick walls. Megaron halls focus authority around hearth, throne, and ceremony. Yet by the end of the Bronze Age, this palace world begins to flicker, burn, and go quiet. The Mycenaean palaces are different from Egypt and Hatti, but they share the same deep dependence on administration. Their scribes write in Linear B, a script adapted from earlier Aegean writing to record an early form of Greek. What they write is not epic poetry, not philosophy, not the songs later Greeks would imagine about heroes before Troy. They write lists. They count sheep, bronze, oil, cloth, land, workers, chariot wheels, armour, vessels, offerings, and allocations. The tablets are plain, practical, and often temporary, but they reveal a world of careful control. The palace does not merely command warriors, it manages production, it directs labour, it gathers goods from the countryside and redistributes them through elite channels. Like other Bronze Age systems, it turns power into accounting. This is one of the strange gifts of destruction. The Linear B tablets survive because fires bake them. Their writers did not intend to leave permanent archives for distant centuries. They were handling current business, pressing wet clay with signs that mattered to palace officials for immediate administrative reasons. Then the palaces burned, and those routine records became time capsules. At Pylos, especially, the tablets preserve a vivid final administrative horizon. They do not tell the full story of the palace's last day, but they show a system still trying to organize itself near the end. Officials are not writing as if civilization has already vanished. They are still counting, still assigning, still managing. Collapse from inside often looks like work continuing until work can no longer continue. The final tablets from Pylos have long fascinated scholars because some appear to involve coastal organization, personnel, and possible defensive concern. The interpretation remains debated, and caution is necessary. They do not give a dramatic narrative of enemy ships approaching in the night. They do not say that invaders are at the gate, but they do suggest a palace attentive to movement, resources, and perhaps danger along its shores, whether the immediate threat was raiding, local conflict, broader insecurity, or something else. The atmosphere fits a world under strain. The palace is watching the edges of its territory, in a time when sea routes no longer guarantee wealth and may carry danger instead. That watchfulness matters. The destruction of Pylos around the end of the 13th century BC is severe, and the palace is not rebuilt as before. Other Mycenaean centres also suffer destruction or decline, though not all at exactly the same moment and not always in the same way. Mycenaean tyranns continue in some form after damage, but the great palace system that had organised late Bronze Age Greece is fatally weakened. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate the causes: warfare, internal unrest, earthquake, drought, trade disruption, invasion, political fragmentation, or some combination. The pattern is uneven, but the outcome is clear. The administrative palace culture of Mycenaean Greece collapses, and with it disappears the use of Linear B. That disappearance is one of the most profound signs of the change. Writing does not vanish because people forget how to speak. It vanishes because the institution that needed this writing no longer functions. Linear B is a bureaucratic script tied to palace administration. When the palaces fall, the economic and political reason for maintaining the scribal system falls with them, for centuries afterward. Greece has no surviving writing in everyday use until alphabetic writing appears in the early 1st millennium BC. This silence has often been called a dark age, though the phrase can mislead. Life continues, communities survive, pottery is made, iron begins to appear more widely. People farm, sail, bury their dead, tell stories, and reshape their identities. But the kind of record left by palace scribes is gone. History does not become empty. It becomes harder to hear. The fall of the Mycenaean world also changes the meaning of old heroic memory. Later Greeks look back to an age of powerful kings, fortified citadels, and legendary wars. They remember names like Mycenae, Pylos, Thebes, and Troy through epic tradition. Though those memories are transformed by centuries of oral storytelling, the world behind the epics is not identical to the archaeological Late Bronze Age, but it may preserve distant echoes, palace elites, warrior values, seaborne expeditions, feasting, gifts, rival kings, and the fragility of glory. The surprising detail is that the people who later inherit the ruins do not fully understand the writing left by the palace scribes. Linear B is forgotten. The tablets sit unread for millennia, preserving a Greek-speaking world unknown to the classical Greeks themselves. In the actual collapse, the human experience would have been more immediate than heroic. A palace burning is not only the fall of a ruler, it is the breakdown of a redistributive system. Workers attached to palace production lose the institution that organized their labor. Craftsmen lose access to centrally supplied materials. Local elites may compete for what remains. Farmers may no longer send goods through the same channels. Storerooms empty or burn. Defensive walls still stand. But the administrative world behind them changes. Some people may experience this as liberation from palace demands. Others may experience it as insecurity, poverty, or loss of protection. No single explanation fully accounts for the variety of local outcomes, because collapse is lived differently depending on where one stands in the system. The Aegean after the palace collapse does not become a wasteland. That is important. Older histories sometimes imagined a sharp descent into total darkness, but archaeology shows continuity as well as disruption. Some settlements persist. Some regions are abandoned while others adapt. Population patterns shift. Burials, pottery styles, metal use, and settlement organization change. The scale of political life becomes smaller. Grand palace-centered bureaucracy gives way to more local communities. The international luxury networks that once connected Mycenaean elites to Cyprus, the Levant, Egypt, and Anatolia weaken or transform. The Aegean world narrows, but it does not end. What disappears is the old confidence of the palace order. The massive walls remain as shells of a previous arrangement of power. The rooms where officials counted bronze and oil no longer anchor the same economy. The scribal hand goes still. The great halls no longer function as centers of redistributive authority. The world that later Greek memory turns into legend has, in archaeology, become a landscape of discontinuity. Some places smoulder, some are repaired, some are left behind. Some shrink into new forms of life that would have seemed modest to the palace elites of the 13th century BC, but that carry human survival forward. The quietness of Mycenaean Greece after the collapse is therefore not emptiness, but a change in volume. The Bronze Age palace speaks loudly through walls, tablets, storerooms, and imported goods. The post-palace world speaks more softly through handmade adjustments, local cemeteries, altered pottery, scattered settlements, and the slow emergence of new habits. It is harder to narrate because it leaves fewer royal statements and fewer administrative lists. Yet this softer world matters because it becomes the ground from which later Greece eventually grows. Long after Linear B falls silent, a new alphabet will appear. Long after the palaces burn, stories of ancient kings will circulate. Long after the bronze networks snap, iron tools and smaller communities will shape a different age. In the end, Mycenaean Greece does not fall like a single tower. It dims like a constellation whose stars go out at different times. Pylos burns and does not return as a palace. Other centers struggle, contract, or transform. The script disappears. The old trade patterns weaken. The heroic age, if later memory may be allowed that dangerous phrase, passes into ruin before becoming song. And among the great mysteries of 1177 BC, the silence of Linear B remains one of the most haunting. An entire administrative world speaking clearly for a final moment, then stopping mid-breath. By this point, the collapse has become too large for a single answer. That is the uncomfortable truth at the centre of 1177 BC. The old desire is to find one cause powerful enough to explain everything: an invasion from the sea, a drought, an earthquake storm, a rebellion, a failure of trade, a new weapon, a famine, a political mistake, a wave of migration. Each of these explanations has evidence behind it in some places. Each one has shaped the debate. Each one can illuminate part of the darkness. But no single explanation fully accounts for the wide, uneven, strangely synchronized breakdown of the late Bronze Age world. The mystery does not become smaller when the clues are gathered. It becomes more intricate. The best way to understand the collapse is not as a single blow, but as a cascade. A cascade begins when one failure triggers another, then another, until the original cause is no longer enough to explain the scale of the result. In a simple society, a bad harvest may be devastating but local. In a highly connected palace world, a bad harvest can affect tribute, labor, military supply, trade demand, migration, political legitimacy, and diplomatic relations. A drought can weaken food stores. Weak food stores can make workers harder to support. Unpaid or underfed workers can reduce production. Reduced production can limit military readiness. Military weakness can invite raiding. Raiding can disrupt trade. Disrupted trade can reduce access to bronze. Less bronze can weaken armies and tools. Weaker armies and tools can make defense and recovery harder. The chain does not move in one direction only. It loops back on itself. This is why systems collapse is such a powerful idea for the Bronze Age. The late Bronze Age world is not fragile because it is primitive. It is fragile because it is advanced in ways that create dependence. Palaces specialize. They centralize. They connect distant regions. They rely on skilled labor, imported materials, scribal administration, diplomatic etiquette, and routes that must remain open. Such a system can produce wealth far beyond what isolated communities could manage. It can build citadels, maintain chariot forces, send luxury gifts across seas, and feed artisans who never touch a plough. But complexity has a cost. The more parts a system has, the more ways it can fail. The more tightly connected those parts are, the more easily failure can travel. Drought alone does not burn Ugarit. Earthquake alone does not explain the disappearance of Linear B. Sea peoples alone do not account for Hittite grain problems, Mycenaean administrative collapse, and the long contraction of Egyptian power. Trade disruption alone does not explain every destroyed city. Internal rebellion alone does not explain the movement of peoples across the eastern Mediterranean. Each cause becomes more convincing when placed beside the others. Climate stress reduces surplus. Reduced surplus weakens central authority. Weakened authority makes migration, raiding, and rebellion more likely. Violence disrupts trade. Trade disruption worsens shortage. Shortage undermines loyalty. Lost loyalty weakens defense. Damaged defense invites further violence. What begins as pressure becomes pattern. The difficulty is that archaeology rarely preserves cascades neatly. It preserves moments, a burned room, a broken wall, a tablet, a buried hoard, a sudden abandonment, a change in pottery, a missing import, a script that stops being used. Later observers have to reconstruct the process from these fragments, and scholars still debate how to connect them. At one site, the final event may be enemy attack. At another, earthquake. At another, abandonment after economic decline. At another, gradual transformation rather than destruction. The temptation is to force all sites into one explanation, but the evidence resists that. The collapse is regional, but it is also local. It is shared, but not identical. That unevenness is one of the strongest arguments for a cascade rather than a single catastrophe. If one invading army had destroyed everything, the pattern might be clearer. If one earthquake had shattered the world, the destruction would follow geological logic more tightly. If one drought had caused uniform famine, the evidence would show a more even environmental signature. Instead, the Late Bronze Age ends in a mosaic of disasters. Some cities burn violently. Some palaces fail administratively. Some regions shrink. Some powers survive in reduced form. Some cultures transform and continue. The system collapses, but people do not all experience that collapse in the same way. A useful image is a row of lamps connected by hidden wires. One lamp flickers first, then another dims, then a third burns too brightly before going out. The room does not go dark all at once, but after a while the pattern is unmistakable. The Late Bronze Age is like that. Ugarit's silence, Hattusa's fall, the fading of Mycenaean palaces, Egypt's exhausted survival, the disruption of trade, the movement of peoples, the signs of drought, the possible earthquakes. The disappearance of scripts and archives in some regions, none of these alone is the whole story. Together, they show an international system losing the ability to absorb shocks. This also explains why earlier wars and disasters had not destroyed the Bronze Age in the same way. The ancient world had known battles before. It had known famine, rivalry, dynastic conflict, and local destruction. Cities had burned and been rebuilt. Kings had lost battles and recovered. The difference near 1177 BC may be that too many stresses arrive close together, across too wide a zone, when the margins of resilience are already thin. A palace can survive one bad harvest if trade continues. It can survive a trade problem if local stores are strong. It can survive a raid if the army is fed and loyal. It can survive an earthquake if labour and supplies are available for repair. But if all these pressures overlap, recovery becomes harder than destruction. There is a lesson here about power that ancient kings would not have carved willingly into stone. Authority depends on the invisible as much as the visible. The visible parts are walls, gates, armies, ships, temples, and thrones. The invisible parts are trust, predictability, stored surplus, stable roots, accepted obligations, remembered procedures, and the belief that tomorrow will resemble yesterday enough for plans to matter. Collapse begins when those invisible parts weaken. By the time the walls burn, the deeper structure may already be gone. The Bronze Age palace world had become skilled at projecting permanence. It knew how to make kings look eternal, how to make treaties sound sacred, how to make storerooms look abundant, how to make writing turn life into order. But it could not fully control rainfall. It could not fully control distant tin roots. It could not fully control ambitious vassals, frightened migrants, unpaid warriors, earthquake damage, or the psychology of fear. The system had many tools for ordinary crisis. It did not have enough tools for cascading crisis. This is why the question of 1177 BC remains alive. It is not only an archaeological puzzle about who destroyed which city, it is a study of how complexity fails. The end of the Bronze Age shows that civilizations do not always collapse because they are weak in obvious ways. Sometimes they collapse because their strengths become liabilities under pressure. Connectivity becomes exposure. Centralization becomes dependence. Specialization becomes inflexibility. Prestige becomes obligation. A palace that once gathered the world into its storerooms discovers that the world can also send its disasters inward. And so the answer, if there is one, is not a single cause but a dangerous convergence. The Bronze Age world falls because drought, hunger, trade disruption, political fragility, Movement, warfare, earthquakes, and administrative rigidity interact in ways no ruler can fully see and no archive can fully record. The collapse is not one mystery with one key. It is a locked system breaking at many hinges at once, and by the time later generations walk among the ruins, the old mechanism has already stopped. After the palaces fall, the world does not become empty. This is one of the most important truths to hold on to, because collapse has a way of making ruins louder than survivors. A burned palace commands attention. A silent archive feels dramatic. A vanished empire leaves a clean shape in historical memory. But beyond the fallen gates, people continue waking in the morning, tending fields, repairing tools, carrying water, keeping animals, burying the dead, honouring gods, telling stories, and making decisions inside a world that has lost its old centres. The end of the Bronze Age is not the end of life. It is the end of one way of organising life. For ordinary communities, the collapse may have felt less like one historical event than a series of adjustments. A palace no longer sends officials to collect goods in the old way. A workshop no longer receives bronze through central channels. A trader hears that a harbour is unsafe and chooses another route, or no route at all. A farmer who once delivered grain into a redistributive system now deals with more local powers. A craftsman recycles metal because new supplies are uncertain. A family moves closer to defensible ground, better water, or kin. The grand diplomatic world of kings has broken, but the smaller geography of survival becomes more important than ever. This smaller world is not necessarily simple or peaceful. The evidence remains incomplete, but archaeology suggests that in many regions settlement patterns change. Some large centres shrink or disappear. Some communities move to different locations. Some areas become more rural. Fortification, local defence, and self-sufficiency may matter more. Imported luxury goods decline in some places, while local styles become more visible. The long-distance elite network that once carried prestige objects and diplomatic gifts across seas weakens, but pottery, tools, foodways, and burial customs continue to change in ways that show people adapting rather than merely declining. One of the surprising features of the post-collapse world is that it can look poorer in royal terms while being more flexible in local terms. Palace civilization leaves grand evidence because it concentrates wealth and writing. When that concentration disappears, the archaeological record can seem dimmer. There are fewer tablets, fewer monumental buildings, fewer rich archives, fewer royal declarations. But this does not mean people have lost all skill or memory. It means their lives are no longer being recorded by the same institutions. A village that survives without palace scribes may be historically quieter, but not culturally dead. A society can become less visible to archaeology while remaining intensely alive to itself. In the Aegean, the disappearance of the Mycenaean palace system brings a world of smaller communities, shifting burial practices, changing pottery styles, and eventually wider use of iron. In Anatolia and northern Syria, Hittite imperial authority fragments, but successor kingdoms preserve and transform older traditions. In the southern Levant, new cultural formations emerge, including Philistine communities with links to the wider Eastern Mediterranean but increasingly local identities. In Cyprus, continuity and disruption exist side by side, as the island adapts to new trade realities and changing regional powers. Egypt continues, but with a narrowing reach. Across the old Bronze Age world, the same basic pattern repeats with local differences the palace system breaks. But human life reorganizes. Iron becomes part of this changing age. though it should not be imagined as a sudden magical replacement for bronze that causes the collapse by itself. Iron objects existed before the collapse, and bronze remains useful afterward. Early iron is not automatically superior. Its importance grows over time as technologies improve, and as access to copper and tin networks becomes less decisive. In a world where bronze supply chains have become uncertain, iron has a long-term advantage because iron ore is more widely available in many regions. The shift is gradual, uneven, and practical. It is not one invention ending an age overnight. It is one more sign that people are learning to live in a world where the old dependencies no longer work as before. Craft traditions also adapt. Metal workers recycle bronze objects, melt down old prestige items, and reshape the material remains of palace wealth into more immediate tools and weapons. Potters change styles, sometimes preserving older habits, sometimes absorbing influences brought by migrants or neighbouring groups. Farmers adjust crops, fields, and storage to local conditions. Religious life continues, though temples and cult practices may transform as political structures change. Myths and memories of the old world may survive orally, reshaped through generations until history becomes legend. What survives in the record suggests not a blank dark age, but a long period of reweaving. The phrase dark age can be useful if it means a time with fewer written sources and less centralized complexity in certain regions. It becomes misleading if it suggests that people simply fall into ignorance. Darkness, in this case, belongs partly to us. We see less because fewer scribes are writing in durable archives. We hear less because the palace microphone has been turned off, but the people living then are not waiting in darkness for history to begin again. They are making the next world out of the broken pieces of the last one. There is a quiet dignity in that kind of survival. It is not the dignity of great kings exchanging gold or carving victories into stone. It is the dignity of continuity without grandeur. A community keeps a field productive. A household preserves a ritual. A smith learns how to work different metal. A sailor follows a safer coastline. A local leader gathers people under new terms. A settlement that would never have impressed the kings of Hatti or Egypt becomes, for those who live there, the centre of the world. Collapse forces attention downward, away from palaces and toward the scale at which most human life has always been lived. This is also where the idea of collapse becomes morally complicated. For palace elites, the end of the Bronze Age is catastrophic loss of authority, wealth, writing systems, international prestige, and inherited identity. For people bound to palace labour, tribute, or strict redistribution, the breakdown may have brought danger but also changed obligations. Some may have suffered greatly from insecurity and scarcity. Others may have found new room for local autonomy. The evidence remains incomplete, and it would be wrong to romanticize collapse as liberation. Hunger, violence, and displacement are real. But it would also be wrong to imagine everyone mourning the palace order equally. Civilizations are not experienced the same way from the throne room and from the fields. After 1177 BC, the world becomes less interconnected in some old ways and more experimental in others. Smaller polities rise, new identities form. The Phoenician cities eventually expand maritime trade in new patterns. Israel and Judah emerge in the highlands within the shifting world of the southern Levant. Aramaean kingdoms become important in Syria. Neo-Hittite states preserve Anatolian traditions under new pressures. Assyria, not yet the overwhelming empire it will later become, continues and eventually grows into a defining power of the Iron Age. Greece, after centuries of quieter transformation, develops new forms of community, writing, memory, and political life. The ruins of the Bronze Age do not stop history, they redirect it. What makes this aftermath so powerful is that it shows how human beings survive the collapse of systems they did not individually create. A palace economy can fail, but the knowledge of planting, weaving, sailing, building, singing, worshipping, and remembering continues in human hands, not unchanged, not untouched, not without loss, but alive. The Bronze Age world of great kings does not return. The old diplomatic language fades, the old trade routes shift. The old scripts vanish in some regions, as yet from the silence after collapse, new worlds begin to speak. So the ashes of 1177 BC are not only an ending, they are soil. In them lie broken tablets, melted bronze, fallen beams, lost names, and the seeds of the Iron Age. The people who live after the collapse do not know they are living in an aftermath that future historians will name. They know only that the old certainties have failed and that morning still comes. They step around ruins, reuse stones, remember what they can, forget what they must, and build smaller fires against a changed horizon. The world that rises after the Bronze Age collapse is not a return to what existed before. It carries pieces of the old age, but the pattern has changed. The great international system of palace kings, copper routes, tin routes, diplomatic marriages, royal gift exchanges, and scribal archives has broken beyond repair. Egypt continues, but with a narrower reach. The Hittite imperial centre is gone, though its memory survives in smaller Anatolian and Syrian kingdoms. Mycenaean palaces no longer command the Aegean. Ugarit remains silent under its ruins. The Eastern Mediterranean has not lost humanity, skill, or imagination, but it has lost the arrangement that once made the late Bronze Age feel like a single connected world. In the centuries that follow, new powers learn to live in the spaces left behind. Some grow from local roots that had long existed beneath imperial attention. Others emerge from movement, mixture, and the reorganization of peoples after crisis. The Phoenician cities, heirs to older Levantine maritime traditions, eventually become some of the great sailors and traders of the Iron Age, carrying goods, ideas, and alphabetic writing across the Mediterranean in new ways. Aramaean kingdoms shape Syria and northern Mesopotamia. Neo-Hittite states preserve fragments of Anatolian royal culture under changed political conditions. In the highlands and lowlands of the southern Levant, new communities develop identities that later become central to biblical history. Assyria, hardened by its own long traditions and opportunities, will eventually rise into one of the most formidable empires the ancient Near East has ever seen. This is the strange legacy of collapse. It destroys one world and clears space for another. That does not make it gentle. It does not turn suffering into progress or loss into destiny. The evidence remains incomplete, and no responsible history should pretend that the people who endured famine, displacement, warfare, insecurity, or the fall of their communities were simply participating in a grand transformation. For them, the collapse was not a clean transition between textbook periods. It was uncertainty, shortage, fear, adaptation, and memory. But from the longer view, the end of the Bronze Age becomes one of those historical thresholds where old structures fail and new possibilities begin moving through the cracks. One of the most important changes is the shift in scale. The late Bronze Age has been a world of great kings speaking to great kings. Its surviving documents often come from palaces, courts, and official archives. Its imagination is vertical, centered on rulers, temples, and capitals. The early Iron Age is often more regional, more fragmented, and in some places more local. Power does not vanish, but it is rearranged. Smaller kingdoms matter, hill communities matter, coastal cities matter. Trade becomes less dominated by the old palace routes and more open to new maritime actors. The world is poorer in some forms of monumental display, but more varied in political experiment. Writing also changes the inheritance of the collapse. In the Aegean, Linear B disappears with a palace system that sustained it. In the Levant, alphabetic traditions continue and eventually become far more influential than the palace scripts of the old order. This matters profoundly. Alphabetic writing is not invented because of the collapse, and its spread is a long, uneven process. But the post-collapse world provides new conditions in which simpler, more adaptable scripts can travel beyond the narrow needs of palace bureaucracy. In time, alphabets will help reshape the intellectual world of the Mediterranean and Near East. The loss of one scribal system becomes part of the background against which other systems expand. Iron, too, belongs to the legacy, though not in the simplistic way once imagined. The Bronze Age does not collapse because iron suddenly appears like a superior weapon from nowhere. Early iron technology is complex, uneven, and not always better than bronze. But in the changed world after the collapse, iron becomes increasingly important because it depends on more widely available ores, rather than the fragile long-distance supply of copper and tin. As skills improve, iron tools and weapons become part of a new economic and military landscape. The metal that names the next age rises not as a single cause of the old world's fall, but as one of the materials through which people adapt to life after that fall. The memory of the Bronze Age also survives in transformed ways. Later Greeks inherit ruins of Mycenaean citadels and tell stories of heroic kings, wars, returns, and broken houses. Those stories are not straightforward records of the 13th century BC, but they may carry distant echoes of a palace world already gone before the poems take shape. In the Levant, memories of migrations, conflicts, kingdoms, and divine promises are reshaped through later traditions. In Anatolia and Syria, royal images and inscriptions preserve pieces of Hittite inheritance after the empire itself has disappeared. Egypt looks back on its own imperial past while continuing under new pressures. Collapse does not erase memory. It changes the vessels that carry it. There is a powerful warning in this. The late Bronze Age was not a weak or simple world. It was wealthy, literate, diplomatic, technologically skilled, and internationally connected. Its elites understood treaties, long-distance exchange, military organization, administration, and symbolic power. Yet its complexity did not save it. In some ways, complexity may have made the crisis harder to contain. The old system needed reliable routes, reliable harvests, reliable loyalty, reliable diplomacy, and reliable supplies of metals and grain. Once too many of those reliabilities failed together, the system could no longer behave like itself. That is why 1177 BC still attracts modern attention. The date is symbolic, but the anxiety is real. It invites comparison not because the ancient world is identical to the modern one, but because both show how connection can create strength and vulnerability at the same time. A crisis in one region can affect another. Food, trade, politics, climate, migration, and war can reinforce one another. Official confidence can outlast material stability. The visible signs of power can remain standing after the invisible supports have begun to rot. Scholars still debate the details, and they should, because the evidence is complicated. But the larger lesson is difficult to ignore. Civilizations rarely collapse from one cause when they have been built from many dependencies. The first dark age after the Bronze Age is therefore not merely darkness. It is shadow and seed together. It is a time when some voices vanish from writing, but others begin forming. It is a time when old capitals lose authority, but new communities gain shape. It is a time when palace archives fall silent, but sailors, farmers, smiths, priests, storytellers, and local rulers keep remaking the world in smaller, tougher forms. Out of the ruins come new kingdoms, new scripts, new trade routes, new identities, and new memories of what power had once looked like. The Bronze Age collapse remains mysterious because it is not a locked room with one hidden murderer. It is a whole house failing in a storm, beams weakened by age, foundations stressed by drought, doors broken by violence, walls cracked by the earth, rooms emptied by hunger, corridors blocked by fear. Each part matters. None alone is the whole. And when the house finally falls, the people outside do what humans have always done. They salvage what they can. They remember what they can bear. They build again, not the same house, but shelter enough for another age to begin. And now the fires grow distant. The palaces are no longer burning in front of us. They are low shapes beneath soil, stone outlines under grass, blackened rooms opened carefully by modern hands. The tablets that once carried orders now carry silence. The bronze that once shone in royal halls has dulled, broken, or been melted into other lives. The sea that brought copper, grain, ambassadors, raiders, and rumours still moves against the same shores. But it no longer remembers the names of the ships. Time does this to every age. It softens the loudest claims. It wears down the gates. It turns kings into fragments and disasters into questions. The people of the late Bronze Age did not know they were living inside a famous collapse. They knew the weather, the harvest, the price of metal, the fear of distant smoke, the hope that a message would be answered, the comfort of a familiar street, the sound of animals at evening, the weight of ordinary work. History later gathers those moments and gives them a date, a title, a mystery. But life was lived one day at a time, even at the edge of an ending. Perhaps that is why the story lingers. It reminds us that civilizations are made not only from monuments, but from trust. Trust that ships will come. Trust that fields will grow. Trust that rulers can protect. Trust that tomorrow will resemble yesterday closely enough for plans to matter. When that trust breaks, the stones may stand for a while, but the world inside them has already changed. Yet the ending is not only ruin. Somewhere after the palace doors close, someone lights a smaller fire. Someone shapes iron. Someone teaches a child a song without naming the empire that has fallen. Someone carries a memory across a hill road, across a harbour, across a generation. The great Bronze Age world disappears, but human life continues under a wider sky, quieter, poorer in some ways, freer in others, still searching for order against the dark. And the last image is not only a burning city, it is the sea at dawn after the smoke has thinned, moving patiently against the coast, washing the stones of a world that believed it would last forever, while beyond the ruins another age begins to wake,